Welcome to our Cash for College FAFSA updates webinar. We're glad you're here. We hope you're excited to learn about all of the changes that are coming to the 2024-25 FAFSA cycle that will be approaching us in December. Date still TBD, so not sure exactly when in December, but sometime in the next couple of months. My colleagues and I have been attending national trainings with NCAN, or the National College Attainment Network, to learn everything we can about the new FAFSA. So last week we were in Dallas learning directly from representatives at Federal Student Aid. So everything we're telling you is the most updated information we could possibly have. That being said, we are still waiting for some details to unfold. So there will be things that we'll learn over the next couple of months that we will certainly relay to you as soon as we get that information. So I just wanted to put a disclaimer at the start that this is the most current information as of Tuesday, October 24th, but things can definitely evolve and change over the next couple of months, and we will definitely keep you updated whenever that happens. My name is May Whiting. I am the Data and Research Director at Alabama Possible, and I am happy to be with you for this training today. So these are our wonderful sponsors that assist us with keeping this work going. So these webinar trainings and professional development opportunities would not be possible without all of the sponsors that you see listed here on the screen. And then, of course, we have our partners who do all of the Alabama Goes to College work with us. So we want to give them special thanks for all of their partnership. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times so that we can avoid feedback during the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel that can be found at youtube.com/AlabamaPossible. Throughout the webinar, you have an opportunity to submit questions using the Zoom chat feature. You also had that opportunity to submit questions during registration. So we will be answering all of our questions towards the end of today's webinar. Any unanswered questions will be addressed in our follow-up email. So we'll be sure to collect everything that doesn't get answered and send out a Google Doc that gives you all of those details you're looking for. So I know time is always kind of short with FAFSA trainings, but we'll do our best to answer as much as possible. And then if you are a high school educator, we ask that you please answer our poll questions, especially those that come towards the end of today's training. That is how you will be eligible to receive your professional development credit. And if you are just joining us, we announced that this training will be about an hour and 15 minutes. So you'll need to hang all the way on until the end in order to see those final poll questions and then receive your professional development credit. Okay, so let's dive in. We ask that you always share your commitment to building a college-going culture on social media. You can find us on several platforms at AL Goes to College. And we hope that if you are not already registered for the Alabama Goes to College campaign, that you will do so. High schools can register at the link you see on the screen. We'll also put that in the chat. But alabamapossible.org/register 2023-24. We have a record number of registrants this year, so we're especially excited to support all of the high schools around the state. Now, if you're not familiar with the Alabama Goes to College campaign, it has 3 different components. Today, we're mostly focusing on our Cash for College component. So the goal of Cash for College is for every graduating senior in the state of Alabama to complete their FAFSA before they graduate from high school. And that is so that they'll be able to access federal aid, state aid, and institutional aid to pay for education after high school. So we're really going to talk a lot about financial aid and the FAFSA today. So our agenda will cover what is the FAFSA and why should students and their families complete it? What are the steps to complete the FAFSA and receive financial aid? And then what we're really focusing on are what are some of the key changes on the 2024-25 FAFSA. And this is the FAFSA that your high school seniors will be completing, hopefully early in December. So we're going to start off with a poll question. I will launch that now, but I just want to get a sense of how comfortable are you with the FAFSA? All right, almost 80% of you have responded, and 44% of you are saying you are somewhat comfortable. We only have 14% who are extremely comfortable, so we hope to raise that percentage, not only with this training today, but with our future trainings that will be happening over the next few months. So thank you so much for responding to that poll question. I'm going to close that out right now. Okay, so what is the FAFSA? The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid, and it is used to determine a student's eligibility for grants, scholarships, work-study jobs, and low-interest loans. So if you're a little bit new to the FAFSA world, there are all kinds of federal aid opportunities. You'll see those listed on the screen here. They'll be linked so that when you receive the slides in our follow-up email, you'll be able to click each one and learn more. But essentially, there's need-based aid, there's situational or circumstantial aid, there's aid that involves working on campus, and then there are loans that have to be paid back. So there's all different kinds of aid. And this is when we're talking about federal aid. So of course, there's also state and institutional aid in addition to what you see on the screen. So why complete the FAFSA? Like we just saw, it gives access to all kinds of federal aid, and there are many need-based aid options. So our students who really need the most support, federal aid is definitely where they want to turn. In fact, most high school seniors in Alabama qualify for Pell Grant aid, and the maximum Pell Grant award is $7,395 per year. So this is aid that doesn't have to be paid back. It is significant if students are receiving that max award, and it's especially significant considering that the average cost of tuition and fees at a two-year college in Alabama is a little over $5,000 a year. So the Max Pell Award would cover almost all of tuition and fees. Why complete the FAFSA continued? It gives access to other kinds of aid. So many non-federal grants and scholarships will require a FAFSA to be on file. So there might be organizational scholarships that say, hey, send over your FAFSA summary so that we can see your need and we'll give you an offer based on what we see from your FAFSA. So it's not just to access federal aid, it's also to access other kinds of aid. And then another reason to complete the FAFSA is because of the positive outcomes that come from completion. So completion of the FAFSA is strongly associated with positive increases in enrollment, persistence, and attainment. So we definitely want to see our high school seniors completing. And just for context around the state of Alabama, more than 36% of Alabama's class of 2023 did not complete a FAFSA. This means they forfeited millions of dollars of free federal aid that was available to them to support their post-secondary pursuits. So we're just going to look at a few different graphs to show you. This is the class of 2022. So this is the first year of our FAFSA policy, meaning that high school seniors were asked to either complete a FAFSA or complete an opt-out waiver. 64.4% of Alabama seniors completed a FAFSA that first year of the policy. Our second year of the policy, 63.6% of seniors completed a FAFSA. So we did have a drop during that second year. And more context that I want to give. So this is the first year of the policy. We saw remarkable increases in FAFSA completion for several different populations. So we saw great increases for low-income students, for high minority schools, and then for really all geographic locales. So the first year of the policy, tremendous improvement. Now, the second year of the policy is where it becomes a little bit more concerning. We saw increases for certain populations, but not others. So we actually saw decreases for low income schools, for schools with high concentrations of students of color, and then for schools in suburbs, towns, and rural locales. So a little bit concerning that we're seeing increases in certain areas and decreases in others with our class of 2023. We want to make sure that with our class of 2024, we're seeing increases across the board. So that is our goal. We want to be there to support you in this work. So feel free to see us as a resource when we're supporting our class of 2024. So all of that context to lead us to what is the work that we have to do as we're preparing students to complete their FAFSA this upcoming cycle. These are our general steps. If you've been with us for a while, then you know that these might look different this year, and that's because the FAFSA has changed. But what hasn't changed are the first few steps. So step 1 is to create an FSA ID. Step 2 is to gather certain documents. Step 3 is that the student will fill out their section of the application. Step 4 is that contributors will complete their section if applicable. Step 5 is that they'll review the FAFSA submission summary. Step 6 is they'll complete verification if applicable. And then step 7, what we all want to get to is where a student is receiving and accepting financial aid offers. So we have 3 stars here on our screen. These are the steps we're really going to focus on today because there are significant changes around these steps. And then our green text that you see on the screen might be new words to you. So these are some new words that are coming to us with the new FAFSA cycle. We'll be going over these words in detail, defining them, getting more familiar with them, but our language around the FAFSA is definitely evolving with this new cycle. So step 1, the FSA ID. Most of you are familiar with this, but an FSA ID is the username and password for accessing your federal student aid account. So we encourage students to go to studentaid.gov to create this in advance of December, so they can already go ahead and get this process rolling. And this year, an FSA ID will be required to start the FAFSA form. So in previous years, students had an opportunity to provide personal identifiers to start a FAFSA form. That will no longer be the case. They absolutely will need an FSA ID. And because it takes around 1 to 3 days to authenticate the ID, we recommend that students get started now and that they definitely get started before they try to complete their FAFSA. New this year is that a verified email address is required. So before, students had an option to do a cell phone number or an email address. An email address is absolutely required for every single person who has an FSA ID this year. And as always, we recommend that with the email address, students are not using a shared email address and that they're not using a temporary work or school email address. They really need to use a personal one that they'll have carried with them throughout their life. So nothing that they'll lose access to like their high school email. So who else needs an FSA ID in addition to the student? The answer to this question depends on whether the student is dependent or independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. We'll talk more about dependency as it relates to the FAFSA, but just know that dependency here is completely unrelated to income tax dependency. So when we're talking about the FAFSA, we're not talking about federal income tax dependency. In our slides, we have linked our dependency questions that many of you are familiar with. These are mostly the same for the 2024-25 cycle, but there are minor changes to the dependency questions. So for independent students, these are students who do not have to report parent information, but they will need their own FSA ID. And then if they're married, their spouse will also need an FSA ID if they did not file taxes together. So most of our students who are high school seniors are not independent students. So this won't apply to many of the students we're working with, but just so you know, the student and their spouse, if they have one and did not file taxes together, they both need an FSA ID. Now, most of our students are dependent students, meaning they will have to report parent information on the FAFSA. So who needs an FSA ID in this situation? Well, which parent has to create an FSA ID and report their information is going to depend on several factors, and we'll be reviewing these in detail. We have a resource to support us in this, and that resource is called Is My Parent a Contributor? And so what we recommend in the coming months, not only are you supporting your students getting their FSA ID, but you're also helping your students understand which parent will need to provide information on the FAFSA and be a contributor. So we'll look at this resource together, but just so you know, now that in two-parent households, both parents will need FSA IDs if they do not file taxes as married filing jointly. That's just because we need both parents' tax information, so they're both going to have to contribute to the FAFSA. So here's the resource that we have linked in our educator toolkit. We're going to go through these questions really quickly, but you can look at them in detail on your own time. The main point that I want you to take away is that these questions are very similar to the questions from previous years. The big difference is that we're no longer considering which parent the student lived with longer. So here's the question sequence we go through. Are your biological or adoptive parents married to each other? So if yes, your parents' marital status is married and both of your parents' information must be included on the FAFSA form. So if your parents did not file taxes jointly, then both your parents are contributors, so they'll need FSA IDs. If they did file together, if they filed taxes jointly, then only one parent will need an FSA ID. So let's say that the student answers no to this. So no, my biological or adoptive parents are not married to each other. Then it asks, do your biological or adoptive parents live together? If yes, your parents' marital status is unmarried and both of your parents are contributors, even if they were never married, are divorced, or are separated. So if they're never married, divorced, or separated, but they're living together, they're both going to be contributors. So they're both going to need to provide information on the FAFSA. So let's say that a student says, no, my parents are not married. No, my parents don't live together. So my parents are living separately. Then the question is, did one parent provide more financial support than the other over the past 12 months? So again, we're no longer considering, in the past it asked, which parent did you live with the longest? That's not a factor anymore. It's just who provided more financial support. So if the student says, okay, one parent did, then that individual will have to be a contributor and create an FSA ID. And if that parent has remarried, then they'll have to include their spouse or the student's step-parent. If the student for some reason says that my parents who do not live together and are not married provided equal financial support, in that case, the individual information, consent, and approval will be of the parent with the greater income or assets. So if the parents are providing equal support to the student, you're going to report the parent who had the greater income or assets. And if that parent has married or remarried, you'll also include their spouse. So largely the same as previous years. Again, we're just no longer considering whom the student lived with longer. So this word contributor that we keep using, I want to define that real quick. A contributor is any individual who's required to provide consent and approval for federal tax information along with their signature on the FAFSA form. So who is this including? This includes the student, student's spouse if they're married, a biological or adoptive parent, or the parent's spouse, so the student's step-parent. So these are people who are contributing their information to the FAFSA. It does not mean that this person is contributing money towards the student's post-secondary education. It just means this person is contributing information to the FAFSA form. And without consent from these contributors, the FAFSA is actually considered incomplete and the student is ineligible for federal student aid. So we'll see this on several slides, but consent is a huge part of the new FAFSA. So getting back to our step one, because we've talked all about who needs an FSA ID, new this year is that parents without social security numbers, including undocumented parents, will need FSA IDs. So there's a whole new process for making sure that these folks can get FSA IDs. This process is not available yet, but it will be available when the new cycle starts. So we recommended to y'all go ahead and get FSA ID creation started. The only population that can't get started on this yet will be our parents without social security numbers. They'll need to wait until this process gets released sometime in December. So how will they get a FSA ID if they don't have a social security number? So they're not going to be authenticated through the Social Security Administration. Instead, they're going to be presented with knowledge-based identity questions. So these are questions similar to those that credit bureaus use to verify someone's identity. So they'll use those questions. If they're unable to verify their identity through these knowledge-based identity questions, then there will be a manual ID proofing process. And what that will look like is that they will submit certain acceptable documentation to the US Department of Education, and then they'll be matched that way. What parents without social security numbers will not do is provide their ITIN number. So some folks, especially undocumented parents, might have an individual taxpayer identification number to be able to file federal taxes. They're not going to be able to get their FSA ID with their ITIN. So since all parents will have an FSA ID, as it is a requirement for this FAFSA cycle, there will be no option to mail in a signature page to sign the FAFSA. So that's kind of good news and bad news. We know a lot of you spend so much time preparing signature pages to be mailed off and approved. So that will no longer be a factor this year. Everyone will be able to sign with their FSA ID. So here's what it looks like. You're familiar with the Create an Account page on studentaid.gov. On step 1 of 7, there's a new little checkbox. I don't have a social security number. So that will be for our parents who don't have a social security number. This is not for our students who don't have a social security number. We got several questions about this through registration, but students who don't have a social security number, for the most part, there are some exceptions, as always. Students who don't have a social security number are largely ineligible for federal student aid and will not be completing a FAFSA. They'll be completing an opt-out waiver. So this is specifically for parents without a social security number. So we talked about the FSA ID. We're moving on to step 2. We're going to just roll through this because it's mostly the same as previous years. But things you can start gathering leading up to December: the social security number of the student, the alien registration number of the student if they're not a US citizen, the dates of birth for both students and parents if the student is a dependent student, the parents' social security numbers if available and the student's a dependent. So remember, for our parents without social security numbers, we have a different process for them. We will look at prior year tax returns if we're manually entering those, but sure hope that no one is manually entering this year because of all the great changes to the FAFSA. But what that means is we'll be looking at 2022 taxes for this 2024-25 FAFSA cycle. And then we'll also need information on child support received and federal benefits received like Medicaid, SSI, SNAP, TANF. And then we'll need information on cash, savings, and checking account balances, investments, and real estate, not including the home. So these are documents that we can go ahead and be gathering leading up to December. So we're going to jump right into the application. We really want to emphasize that the 2024-25 FAFSA is what our high school seniors will be completing, because that's how they apply for aid for fall semester 2024 through summer semester 2025. Whereas the 2023-24 FAFSA is used to apply for fall semester 2023, so right now, through summer semester 2024. And it is particularly important that students are completing the correct form, because these two FAFSAs are totally different and data cannot be pulled from one to the other. So make sure your students are doing the 2024-25 FAFSA. If your student is contemplating enrolling in summer courses immediately after they graduate from high school, you'll need to advise them to ask their college about which FAFSA to complete, because different colleges use different FAFSAs for summer semester. So it totally depends on the institution, and any student completing summer courses will need to reach out to the financial aid office, because they might need to complete both the 2023-24 and the 2024-25. So with our actual application, when a student starts the FAFSA for this new cycle, the application will start by presenting the student with student identity information. And this is going to be pulled directly from what the student submits when they're creating their FSA ID. If there's anything incorrect that they see when they start the application, they'll need to edit the information in their account settings. They won't be able to edit the information directly in the FAFSA form. So they'll have to go back into their account on Federal Student Aid and correct any of that information. So this is what it looks like. You'll see none of this is editable. They'll have to actually go to their account to edit it. So that's the first screen they see. After that, students are needing to consent to have their federal tax info directly transferred from the IRS in order to be eligible for federal aid. So this is the case even if a student is a non-tax filer or a foreign tax filer, they still have to provide consent. So they're consenting for the IRS to check whether or not they have taxes on file and directly pull those to the US Department of Education. So if there are no taxes on file, no problem at all. They've just at least provided their consent that the IRS can do that pull. So this new process of pulling tax information is through what we're now calling the direct data exchange. Should be much smoother than what we formerly know as the IRS data retrieval tool. So it's going to seamlessly transfer in an individual's federal tax info directly to the Department of Education. So the student and their contributors will provide consent and approval for that transfer to happen. And once that information is transferred, it's not going to be seen anywhere on the front end of the FAFSA. It's all just going to be on the back end. So students and parents, they're not going to see the questions that are asked about taxes. They're also not going to see the answers that were provided to those tax questions. Like I mentioned, the FAFSA uses prior year tax information. So for the 2024-25 FAFSA, again, that is the 2022 tax returns that were filed this past spring or whatever in 2023. And even though this process should be much smoother than the IRS data retrieval tool, we're still going to recommend that families actually have a paper copy or an electronic copy of their tax returns for reference for certain other questions. And so we'll highlight those other questions as we move throughout our slides today. So the student starts out, they see their identity info, they do the consent process, and then they really get to the main part of the application. So we have the following sections: personal circumstances, demographics, financials, colleges, and signature. It's a little bit different from previous years, but not too much. So you see here, we're starting out in our personal circumstances section of the student's application. So here they're answering about their marital status. Now, the rest of the personal circumstances section mostly includes what we know as our dependency questions. So the questions that are being asked to determine if the student has to provide parent information or not. And these questions are largely the same as previous years. There are only a few minor changes. So the main ones that we want to highlight are that if the student has children or other people living with them for whom they provide half of the financial support, they now are required to provide that financial support now and during the period of receiving financial aid. In previous years, they just had to provide that support during the period of financial aid. But for the new FAFSA, they have to actually be providing the support now when they're filling out the FAFSA. And then our other minor change for homeless students, this is a very positive change. A director of a project that is supported by a federal TRIO or Gear Up program can designate a student as homeless. So with homeless students, there are several different officials who can verify that the student is indeed homeless, and the number of officials is expanding, which is definitely a positive thing because we want those students to be as supported as possible in this process. So that was a lot of information. I just want to take a brief pause to look at questions in the chat before we get too far in the rest of our session. So I see one question: can you file paper FAFSA if the parent cannot get verified for an FSA ID? That is an option that we have seen promoted by Federal Student Aid, the National College Attainment Network, that especially if a student is trying to meet a deadline and so they're trying to get resolution quickly, we've seen that a paper FAFSA can be recommended so that at least their information is submitted. They might have some follow-up tasks to do afterward, but they're getting their information out there to the appropriate places. So yes, paper FAFSA will be available in that instance. And I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to continue on, but we'll still have time for Q&A at the end. Oh, did someone want to come off mute?
Yes, May. There is, I saw one that says, is there any data that tells how many students actually use Pell Grant?
Absolutely, yes. In the state of Alabama and both nationwide, we have that data available. I'd be happy to share it with you in our follow-up email, but we know how many students are receiving Pell Grant in Alabama. We also know the average Pell Grant award. So remember, the max Pell award for the current year is $7,395. Some students receive partial awards, so maybe they're receiving 2,000 or 3,000, and we know for the state of Alabama what that average award is. So I can get that information to you after. All right, we'll continue on. So moving on with the application. So the student in the personal circumstances section, this is where they're determining if they're a dependent, so they need to provide parent info, or an independent, so they don't need to provide parent info. If a student is a dependent student and they cannot provide parent info, then they can indicate that they have unusual circumstances. So in the past, we've actually called this special circumstances. This year, we're calling it unusual circumstances. But essentially, it allows a student who maybe can't get into contact with their parents, maybe they're estranged, maybe their parents present a danger to them. This allows dependent students to still get their student aid index, so still understand their aid eligibility without providing parent information. We'll talk more about this later, but the student aid index, it is what is replacing the expected family contribution. So we're now going to be referring to the SAI instead of the EFC. But students who are in these unusual circumstances, they will indicate so on the FAFSA. Afterwards, they'll need to provide documentation of their circumstances. So these can be things like documented interviews, phone calls, court records, things like that to show that they are a dependent for the purposes of the FAFSA, but they cannot or should not, because of dangerous situations, get in touch with their parent for their parents' info. So here's what it looks like on the FAFSA. I know it's a little bit small, so you might not be able to read it, but they give just a few situations that could apply to this unusual circumstances definition, but it could be, this isn't exhaustive. There could be more reasons than this. But one example is that the student left home due to an abusive or threatening environment. So do unusual circumstances prevent the student? If so, then they can indicate yes. Now, for those students who are dependents and do not have unusual circumstances, they are going to need to invite their parent or their contributor to complete their section of the FAFSA. So for dependent students, the application is going to ask a series of questions to determine which parent should add their information. So you saw those questions on that resource that we had linked in the slides, that Is My Parent a Contributor resource. That resource is essentially going to be mimicked in the application. So all of these questions will be asked here. Are your parents married to each other? Do they live together? Did one parent provide more financial support than the other? So same questions, and it will say, great, this means this parent has to provide information. So as long as you answer the questions accurately, they'll tell you exactly who needs to provide information, which is a huge upgrade from the previous years. So really can't go wrong here, hopefully. Again, this is our standalone resource to support this process. So this is in our toolkit. You can go ahead and talk to your student about these questions so that they know who will be contributing to their FAFSA. Again, when we are talking about the parent for the purposes of the FAFSA, we're not talking about just any person the student lives with. We're not talking about a grandparent, an aunt, or an uncle. We're talking about biological or adoptive parents, as well as step parents. So remember, like, our students live with all kinds of guardians. Unfortunately, the FAFSA wants to know about parents. So that's always a hiccup that we face each year. As this is a bit complicated each year, I just want to say that we will be having future trainings where we go through this in detail. Today, we're really focusing on FAFSA updates, so I just want to mention that. So when a student is going to invite their parents to complete their section of the FAFSA, they're going to have to submit the name, date of birth, social security number, and email address of their contributor. If the parent does not have a social security number, then the student is going to provide a mailing address instead. So all this information will be how we invite the parent to contribute. And if the student enters any information incorrectly, they will need to correct it in order for the invitation to be successful. So I just want to admit up front, this is kind of a huge burden for y'all. When students are doing their section of the application, they're going to have these details for the appropriate parent. And we know some students don't even know their own social security number, much less their parents. So this is something you can go ahead and work on with your students so that they have it in order to invite their parent to submit the FAFSA. This is what it looks like. So invite parent to your FAFSA form. We're doing the name, the date of birth, social security number, or saying that my parent doesn't have one, and the email address. The email address can be any email address that the parent uses. It doesn't necessarily have to be the email address that the parent will use to create their FSA ID. This is just wherever the parent wants the actual invitation to go, but it should go to the parent and not the student's email address. So the student will invite their parent, and then they'll proceed on with the application. So they'll move into the demographics section, which is asking questions about the student. And these are optional survey questions. You saw them last year. They were at the end of the application. Now they're more towards the middle of the application. They're questions about race, ethnicity, gender. The student has the option to not answer those questions and proceed. After they get through those optional survey questions, though, they will be asked questions about their citizenship, their parental education status, and then their high school completion status. All the same as previous years, so not too much to worry about there. Then from the demographics section, they'll move on to the financial section. And this is where they will answer a few questions about their taxes. So if the student's a tax filer, then they're going to use the direct data exchange. They'll pull all that tax information into the FAFSA, and then they'll have 2 additional tax questions to answer. They'll be answering questions about the amount of grants, scholarships, and benefits reported as income to the IRS. So just know this is not going to apply to our high school seniors. They're not already getting grants and scholarships that they're reporting as income. And then they're going to report for an earned income exclusion. So this is largely applying to our students who are already in college. For our non-tax filers, which might be the majority of our high school seniors, they will have no tax questions to answer. So when they get to the financial section, they're really probably only going to see 1 screen. So huge improvement from previous years. So right after the tax questions, we have questions about assets. Assets now include total cash, savings, and checking accounts, the current net worth of businesses and investment farms, regardless of size. So that has changed from previous years. And then the current net worth of investments, including real estate. We know assets can be a point of confusion for folks, so there is a guide that we will have available in our toolkit. We're not going to go into too much detail here, but for the most part, students are really only going to be answering questions about cash, savings, checkings account. All students are going to actually see the asset question. So you might remember in previous years that based on the skip logic the FAFSA employed, some students never even saw a asset question. This year, if the student, not the parent, starts the application, they're always going to see that asset question. And that's because the exemption from reporting assets ultimately depends on the parent income and the parent receipt of federal benefits. So because the student's starting the application, the FAFSA is not yet going to know about parent income and receipt of benefits. So it's just going to ask the asset questions anyway. If it turns out that the student's parent has income or receipt of federal benefits that qualifies them to not report assets, then the FAFSA is not going to worry about what the student added about their savings account. But the student will see those questions, they'll answer them accurately, and then the FAFSA will know whether or not to actually use those answers based on what the parent provides. So after that, we're moving on to our colleges section. Exciting this year that the student can add up to 20 colleges to receive their FAFSA information. So they don't have to put in 10, go back and do 10 more. They can do all 20 up front. Right after they report which colleges they want to receive their financial information, they're going to be asked to review their entire FAFSA application before they sign. They're also going to have an opportunity to see whom they invited to contribute to their FAFSA and the status of that invitation. So this is our review page. You see each of the different sections that they moved through, so they can click the drop down to see more detail. And then they're going to make sure all of that looks great before they go and sign. Here's where they say, oh, hey, I see that you have 2 parents who needed to provide information to your FAFSA. You sent a request on this date. That invitation has been sent, and here's the status. So if the contributor has completed their section, I imagine the status will say something like section complete. But this is really helpful for students to know if their parent has done their portion. We move on to the signature section, and this is where the student will acknowledge the terms and conditions before signing. I'm super excited about this next part because this is going to clear up a lot of confusion that we faced year after year. There is now new language around signing and submitting. It's so much clearer, it's way more accurate. Basically, when their part is complete, a dependent student is told, hey, good job doing your section. Now your contributor must also complete the remaining section before they can submit the FAFSA. So there's no longer any confusing congratulations screens that make the student feel like, oh, I'm done. This is what they see instead. You're almost there. There's more to come. The student section is complete. Now your contributors have to complete their part. So they tell you what to do next. Check your email. Your FAFSA form still needs contributor information, and then helpful things that you know. So I hope y'all are excited about that the way that I am. I think that's a huge improvement from previous years. So we're moving on to step 4. Contributors are invited to complete their section. So you see here a sample email of what they might receive saying, hey, you've been invited to provide information. Your student's not eligible for aid without your information. So huge implications there. The contributor, if they don't already have an FSA ID, they'll need to create one. Once they create one and log in, they'll see a screen that says you've been requested to be a contributor by your student. And then it's going to give all kinds of helpful information about why it's so important to contribute your information to your student's FAFSA. So contributors will also have to consent to the IRS sharing their federal tax information. Again, consent is absolutely necessary for the student to be eligible for aid. Without consent, there's almost no point doing the FAFSA. When a contributor logs in with their FSA ID, they're going to see the same kind of identity information that the student saw, but for themselves. And then they're going to complete that consent process. After that, they're only going to see 3 sections: demographics, financials, signature. So here's the demographics, very similar to the student demographics. They're going to indicate their marital status. Then they're going to answer a few more questions before they move into the financial section. One big part of the financial section here is that they're going to answer if they have received any federal benefits. So you'll have a list of the programs that they're asking about there. And then within the financial section, it's so much shorter than previous years because we have all that tax information already pulled in, assuming that the parent isn't going to have to do it manually. And then basically what the FAFSA is going to ask is, hey, we see what your family looks like on your federal tax return, but is your family size different in reality? So for the purposes of federal income tax, there are so many rules around who can be included in the household, so who can be included as a federal tax dependent. And the FAFSA is saying, we know our dependency is different. Is there anyone else in your family that should be included on your FAFSA? So essentially it's asking, are you providing more than half of the financial support for other people in your house? Maybe a grandparent lives in the house and the parent provides more than half of the financial support for that grandparent. That grandparent might not be on the taxes, but they would be included in the FAFSA family size. So we'll go into more detail about this at a later date, but just wanted to give you a little preview here. In the financial section, contributors will be asked if the family size is different, and they'll be able to update that family size. They're also going to be asked about the number of people in the family who will be in college during the year that aid is received. In the past, this information has actually been used to calculate aid eligibility or aid need. This year, the information will not be used to calculate eligibility, but it's still being asked because of the law. This information can be used in professional judgment. So if parents are supporting multiple students who are in college, a college can use that information to make professional judgment and increase aid. It's not necessarily, it will not impact aid eligibility from a federal standpoint, though. Like the students in the financial section for the parents or the contributors, they'll have to answer a few extra questions, even if their tax info is pulled from the direct data exchange. So for parents, they're going to have to answer a question about earned income tax credit. That's why we recommended, even if the information is being pulled directly from the IRS, it's still great to have a paper or an electronic copy of federal income taxes, because we'll have these few extra questions that we need to be able to answer. So one is earned income tax credit. The other 2 are what the students saw. The contributors are asked both about child support received and assets. So exact same asset questions as the student. And then if the parent has a spouse, they'll be asked about their spouse, and they'll also be asked about their tax filing status. That will be used to determine whether the other parent needs to have their own FSA ID. So if the student is in a two-parent household and those parents filed their taxes separately, so they did not file married filing jointly, both parents are going to need separate FSA IDs, so each of them can contribute their tax information to the FAFSA. After that, we go to the signature page. The parent will see a congratulations screen only if the student's part is already complete. So once all the sections are complete, they see congratulations. Now, the last contributor to provide information will have the opportunity to submit the FAFSA. So if the student's starting the FAFSA, they'll be able to sign and then invite their contributors. They won't be able to officially submit. So if the parent is the last contributor, they're going to see the congratulations page. It's going to have pretty limited information. And once the parents completed their part, the student's going to receive the information via email with their student aid index and their aid eligibility. If the student is the last contributor, then they're going to see a full confirmation page upon submission, and they'll have that SAI and their aid eligibility. Now, the flow that we showed you today, steps 1 through 7, we showed the student starting first. That is what we recommend. We recommend students starting first, inviting their contributors, contributors completing their section, and then submitting the FAFSA. So step 5 is our submission summary. The FAFSA submission summary was formerly known as the Student Aid Report, or the SAR. It just shows the processed FAFSA form and any subsequent corrections made. At the top of the submission summary, they're going to see information about when the form was received, when it was processed. They're going to also have the option to print the page. And through each of these tabs here, there's lots of information, but I believe it's from the next step section, they're able to directly make corrections from that point. So this is the new version of the Student Aid Report. On the eligibility overview tab of this summary, the student is going to see information about federal aid they may be eligible for, such as the Pell Grant and direct loans. They are also able to view that student aid index, which has replaced the expected family contribution. It's important to note, though, that any amounts of financial aid that display on the tab are only estimates, they're not guaranteed. So this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but for those who are interested about how aid is calculated, the new SAI has a few changes from the EFC. So when calculating the SAI, family size is automatically calculated based on tax forms, but like we mentioned, it can be updated to accurately reflect family size. The number in college, so the number of students a parent has in college, is no longer considered when calculating a student's need. Businesses and farms of any size are counted as an asset. So before, if you had employees of 100 or fewer, then you didn't have to count those as assets, but now regardless of size, you do. And then SAI is a number, so negative 1,500 is going to reflect the highest financial need. Students and families don't need to know this. This is really for practitioners, but just in case you were wondering what's changed, thought I'd give you some information there. So here we have our submission summary. You see this student estimated being the key word, they're eligible for up to $4,556 in federal Pell. So remember, with Pell, you can receive the max award amount, you can receive a partial amount. It also tells the student what loans they might be eligible for, or federal work study. It says they may be eligible. So our last 2 steps, we're going to breeze through these. Verification, if you're not familiar, it's the process by which students provide additional documentation to verify what they've included on their FAFSA. It is currently unclear how the new FAFSA cycle, which we're referring to as the Better FAFSA, how all of these changes are going to impact the verification process. The hope is that the direct data exchange will make things much simpler and verification will not be as necessary. But all of this is really to be seen at a later date. So we'll provide more information as we have it. Our last step is students done everything they need to do. They're waiting for their aid offers. The important thing to note here as we're completing the application, if the information on the FAFSA, so we're using 2022 tax information, if that 2022 tax information does not reflect the student's actual financial information or situation, the student can share special circumstances with the financial aid office of each college where they're applying. So special circumstances, we're now referring to those as anything that has changed to make the student's financial situation more relevant, and they'll need to add updates to the financial aid office. So this can include any changes to or loss of employment, any medical bills that have happened since the 2022 tax year, or any other expenses that are really impacting a student's ability to pay for college. And the financial aid office can use this information to make professional judgment. So a student with special circumstances can contact their financial aid office and tell them about their situation so that the financial aid office can have the full picture. So key messages for our students, these are largely the same. The FAFSA is free to complete. It is for both technical and professional certificates as well as academic degrees. The student may be eligible for up to $7,395 per year in Pell. In addition to federal aid, many non-federal grants and scholarships require FAFSA completion. The student needs to be aware of scholarship and FAFSA priority deadlines at the colleges where they're applying. So they should look for each school where they're applying. Key messages for our families, including our parents: the FAFSA is safe and secure using studentaid.gov. It's only used to determine students' eligibility for financial aid and nothing else. The student needs your help as a parent to get key information from you, the contributor. And even if a family thinks they don't qualify for aid, it's good to have the FAFSA on file in case of the unexpected. So this is our same messaging year after year. So I want to provide some resources. We're going to drop a link in the chat because a few of these opportunities are coming up tomorrow and Thursday. Federal Student Aid is doing their virtual boot camp. I think they have about 6 different opportunities, one of which is highlighting all of the changes that we've just touched on here, as well as doing a demo of the new FAFSA. So feel free to register through Eventbrite for this virtual boot camp. Federal Student Aid also has a Better FAFSA landing page. We'll have this linked in the slides for you to access. As always, the hotline is available. I don't necessarily recommend calling the hotline about the upcoming FAFSA cycle. We don't know that they're trained on the new FAFSA yet, so they might not be helpful to you. Feel free to use us as a resource. We'll have our hotline number in a few slides. We have our educator toolkit. It's our Google Drive full of resources that we've included in the slides here as well. And then the National College Attainment Network also has a training toolkit that you can look at. Another resource, Federal Student Aid is adding videos to their YouTube channel. So they have a 2024-25 FAFSA video playlist. These are really short, like 2 to 3 minute videos that might be good to share with your families via email or via a newsletter. Here's our help desk. Like I mentioned, you can call or text us at 334-316-6155. We'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, especially as it relates to financial aid. So definitely feel free to give us a ring or a text. And now I would like to entertain some questions in the chat. If you are looking for some of the links, those will be in our follow-up email, but Yuriba has also included them in the chat as well.
I've been collecting them. Let's see. One says, will students who are in legal guardianship still be independent?
Yes, that is correct. So they have not released the dependency questions for the upcoming FAFSA cycle, but the only changes to those dependency questions, I believe, are the ones that we highlighted. So the one that asks the student whether or not they're providing half of the financial support for a child or other dependent. Again, they have to be providing that support now and during the year that aid is received. And I think those are really the only changes. The only other changes with homelessness, and that's just who can designate a student as homeless.
Okay. And I think our last question that I saw in the chat was, other than the AIC portal, will we have preparer access like we had in the past to see the status of the student's FAFSA?
Interesting. I didn't know that y'all were using that kind of access. The AIC portal, which we'll definitely talk about in an upcoming webinar, will be the best way for high school educators to monitor the progress of FAFSA completion for their students. So they'll be able to see when a student submits, when a student completes, if the student has any outstanding tasks that they need to take care of. If you want to elaborate on the preparer access you're referring to, I want to make sure I answer that question appropriately.
Hey, May, that was my question. So what I have been able to do, and I discovered this by accident, but I was helping a student last year complete their FAFSA, and I went in, they left my room and I didn't have, I was like, oh my goodness, I don't know, like their save key and all that stuff. And so I clicked on the, the options they give you. I'm the student, I'm the parent, I'm a preparer. So I went in as a preparer and it gave me more detail than the AIC portal. And
Gotcha.
so it told me, oh, this isn't complete because the parent didn't sign, or it gave me way more detailed information than the AIC portal did. And so again, last year, like I said, I discovered that, but I just wanted to know if we will have that, because I noticed on one of your slides before and going in, it was only the student and the parent. I didn't see the preparer one this time.
So the FAFSA is still completely role-based. So when you're accessing the FAFSA, you're indicating your role. Everything that I've seen so far for the 2024-25 FAFSA has only had the option for student or contributor. I have not seen anything, the third option that you're referencing. Now, the FAFSA is still not ready to go. So that preparer option could be added, but we saw several preview screens at our conference last week and none of them had the preparer option. So we'll keep you updated on that, but that could be helpful.
Another one that we have is, are the slides used in this presentation in the educator's toolkit, like the FSA ID steps, etc.?
They're not currently in the toolkit. We can definitely add those. They'll also be in the follow-up email. So we can do both. We can put it in the follow-up email as an attachment, and then we can add them to the toolkit as well. My caveat there is that, like my disclaimer at the start of the webinar, this is constantly evolving. So this is current information as of October 24th. It could very well change because I've seen several resources online from other state agencies that are already outdated and they were created in September. So things are changing quickly and I'm hesitant to have anything up that could be downloaded and then not understood that it is no longer relevant. So let me think about whether we want to put it in the toolkit. We might just send it out via email because I don't want to mislead anyone. And whenever we have new information, we'll update you so that you have the most accurate info.
Okay. I'm sorry, may I unmute and ask this question, please?
Sure.
Great, thank you. If a student by any chance does not invite a particular parent that should be invited, but at the end, when I saw where the parent put in the financial information and it indicated at that time who else might need to, will the student need to have to invite that person, or would they automatically be invited once they would figure out that another parent is needed?
If another parent is needed, so if the flow you mentioned, the student starts, they invite one parent, another parent is needed in addition, the first parent can invite the second parent.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, and the last question I see in the chat is, during the NCAN webinar series, they noted that students receiving free lunch should note that on their FAFSA to avoid questions about assets, including those on system-wide free lunch.
Great question. So with that question about federal benefits received, including free lunch, that question is actually posed to the parent or the contributor. So the parent will see that. So if the student is a dependent student, their parent will see that question. When a parent answers that question, we've gotten differing guidance on this. So from a college access perspective, everyone is going to tell you if you're on system-wide free lunch, the question is technically asking you, are you receiving this federal benefit? And the answer is yes, I'm receiving it. Am I in need of that federal benefit? Maybe not everyone, but technically, if you're answering the question that they ask, even someone from a very high income household could indicate, yes, I'm receiving free lunch, and then they would not have to report assets. Now, federal student aid has guided us that their intention behind that question is to gauge means tested benefits. So they want to know who actually needs these benefits. So we'll continue to update you on the actual guidance around it, but when a parent sees that question, they're free to answer, yes, my student receives free lunch, whether or not they're in need of that free lunch. See a few more questions coming in.
So we just received another one that says, if a student is adopted, if a student is adopted by a grandfather who isn't married, then will it be a clear answer?
So when we're thinking about who's a parent reporting information on the FAFSA, it's biological or adoptive parent. So what we always want to make sure is that the student isn't confused about whether their grandfather has adopted them or is their legal guardian, because that really matters. So just checking with the student, have you been legally adopted? If so, that grandfather might be your parent on the FAFSA. If that grandparent is just a legal guardian, then the student would be independent for the purpose of the FAFSA. So it's just making sure that we're understanding what the terms mean, and then whether or not that person can be considered a parent on the FAFSA. But that is a great point, that largely it's going to be biological parents, but in adoptive situations, it might be the grandfather who's an adoptive parent.
Okay, and then the last one that I see in the chat is, do parents have to create a new FSA ID if they already have one?
No, they don't, which is great. So only if parents have never had a federal student aid account will they need to create a new FSA ID. So they might be prompted to add a verified email to their account when the new cycle starts, because that verified email is important with this upcoming cycle. But if they already have an account, no need to create another one. Definitely encourage them not to create a second one, because that could create all kinds of problems. So especially for our parents who already have students who've started college, they're probably good to go with the FSA ID creation process. Well, thank you all so much for your questions. I'll still allow you to put them in the chat, but I want to go ahead and get our poll started so that we can end on time. We hope this information has been useful to you, so we're going to gauge your satisfaction with today's webinar. Just know these are the highlights. We will be providing much more down the line, so lots to come. But I'm going to give a few moments for this set of questions. There will be a second set of questions right after, so please hang on for the second set of questions. Okay, I saw another question come in. What if we have a student whose parents are not in the country with them? We have a lot of students who live with other guardians and not their parents. Absolutely. So we're still going to use first the FAFSA's dependency questions to see if that student's a dependent. Then we're going to use the is my parent a contributor resource. If that parent is considered a contributor, then they will have to provide information whether or not they live in the country. So again, the FAFSA really, unfortunately, does not care who the student lives with. It cares who the parent is, and then it also cares if that parent is providing financial support to the student. So Unfortunately, a guardian that a student lives with will not be considered a FAFSA parent unless that guardian has adopted the student. And Stacy, if you have any situations that you would like to run by us specifically, definitely feel free to call our help desk line. Yeah, we handle all kinds of situations, and we know for many of our students, it isn't super cut and dry. So feel free to reach out. Okay, ending this poll now and going to our last one so that we end on time. We will be providing a copy of these slides in our follow-up email. So give us a few hours to get that turned over to you, but we'll have links to our resources as well as the slides as an attachment. Haley asked if we can get answers to the questions in the follow-up as well. I can work on that. I started a resource with some of the registration questions, so I can add your in-person webinar questions to that and get it sent out. I just might have a link to a working Google Doc that I continue to add to. So the recording of the webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Alabama Possible. It takes us a little time to get that turned over, but keep an eye on the YouTube channel. It should be up in the next few days. And then the slides will get to you fairly immediately. I'm just gonna go ahead and get the professional development information up on the slide so that y'all see it. We are gonna have this in the follow-up email, but for our high school educators, you'll need to log into PowerSchool and use course number 309514, section number 487454. So I'll leave this up on the slide for just a little bit. If you need to head out, we've reached our hour 15. So thank you all for sticking with us for so long. We have a few more slides if you can hang around, but if not, no worries, we'll send these out to you. If you would like to reach us, again, we have that help desk number 334-316-6155. You can also email us, algoestocollege@alabamapossible.org. All right, ending this poll now. And we did have a few questions submitted during registration that I wanted to answer. But we had a few questions submitted during registration. I think we covered them during the slides, but just to address them directly, I'm going to pull them up right now. So a lot of questions about our undocumented population or our parents without a social security number. So we had a question if they can create an FSA ID with their I-10 from their tax return, and no, they cannot. Currently, what we're being told is that the I-10 will not be used. Instead, they'll answer knowledge-based identity questions. So these are things that use consumer data like credit bureaus use, and they'll verify their identity that way. If they're not able to do so, there is a manual ID proofing process, and the Department of Education will give us more guidance on what documents are acceptable for that process. Our other question was about students who don't have a social security number. Do they complete a FAFSA opt-out waiver? In most cases, yes. In most cases, if a student does not have a social security number, they're ineligible for federal student aid, and they should not complete a FAFSA. However, there are some exceptions to this, one exception being students from freely associated states. So I would advise you to consult FSA's resource for eligible non-citizens. I can include that in the follow-up email, but really what I would advise you to do in situations like this is call our help desk, so 334-316-6155. It's always best to confirm that a student can't complete the FAFSA before handing them an opt-out waiver. We want every single student who can complete a FAFSA to complete one. So check to see if students are eligible before handing them an opt-out waiver. Opt-out waiver is our last resort if possible. We know it comes down to it sometimes, and if you're in that situation at the end of the year, don't hesitate to give a student a FAFSA opt-out waiver. But until then, we want to assist students in any way we can if they're able to complete the FAFSA. All right, if there are no other questions in the chat, then that is the end of our webinar. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the future for other FAFSA trainings.